Hello and welcome to the Managing Madrid podcast. This is your host, Kiyan Sobhani, and I am joined on a Sunday night after we defeated Real Betis at the Benito Villamarin 5-3. And to help break it down is Arvind, our tactical guru. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good. That was an enjoyable match by the end of it.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed tweeting that on the Managing Madrid account because by the end I was just feeling so pumped. Now that I've calmed down a bit, I have some criticisms to dish out, but yeah, I can't deny that I'm happy with that result. When for a while it looked like that game was just gonna fly away from us.
In case you don't know this by now, you should have known this like in December at the latest, but you just can't miss a Real Betis game this season. They far and away, our friend David Garrido put out a tweet, like he kind of just went through and saw which teams have the most goals in their games combined, conceded and scored, and it's Real Betis like by a million miles. It's just like classic Quique Setien in a nutshell, and this game kind of encapsulated it.
Yeah, Quique Setien is the new Paco Gemes. I mean, if you because both attempt positional play, and both teams' defense is questionable. I think Quique Setien's defensive structure is a little better, and I think he tries to defend more. But what they're trying to do is essentially the same.
I think I understand what you're saying. I guess just because I have more respect for Quique Setien, maybe I would just say that Paco Gemes is a poor man's Quique Setien. Is that fair?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I can disagree with that. I do prefer Setien over Paco Gemes, but yeah. I still don't know if I feel like Setien has enough pragmatism, or at least from my opinion is pragmatic enough.
I agree with that. I think you see glimpses of it. So he has this insistence to play the ball out of the back, and that still lingers in Las Palmas, which has kind of long moved on from him. But in terms of ideology, it's the same idea. Las Palmas have this: they bring the ball out of the back, they force the issue sometimes, and they concede, and they are just a complete black hole defensively. Betis are semi better than that. I think Marc Bartra was a good pickup for them in that sense.
Yeah,
to strengthen it a bit. And I thought he was good today, but what we did see from Quique, like it's interesting. You look at the game at the Bernabeu earlier this season where Betis won 1-0. It was a complete deviation from Quique. Like it was. He went in and he played like this low block and defended like crazy. They got a little bit lucky and then they score at the end. But and then this is a completely flipped script from that, where they actually just like took it to us. And so there's a lot to discuss in here. And I know you have a lot to say, and we were talking about this off air a bit. I obviously want to get your thoughts. My feeling is, while there was a lot to say from a tactical point of view, I also think the theme overall was also simple. So there's like a simple theme where we had a 4-4-2 structure, and a 4-4-2 traditionally, theoretically, should give you a sound defensive structure. But in this case, we were vertically completely open, inviting vertical passing. There was the passing lanes, we just weren't reading them. The zone 14 that we bring up every now and then, that was completely empty for us. There was no stopgap there, and it was just really easy for Setien's team to just build these passing triangles and just build their way up. I feel like it was crazy how easily they got through. And you look at the stats after the game, Joaquin 4 key passes, Fabian 4 key passes, Budabus 3, Guardado, Barragan, all these guys, like it was just so easy for them to penetrate.
Yeah, and I think there's two reasons for that. So first, as we were discussing before we began the pod, was this continual theme where we don't know if we want to press or if we want to sit into a medium block. And obviously you can choose to do intermittent pressing. The key is that when you're not pressing, your team moves out of positions from which they can press in, and they become more vertically compact. Because when you press, you want your players to be higher up the pitch and positioned in a way where they have access to the ball so they can effectively try to win it back or force bad passes. And so after that first minute where we pressed rather well, we did that thing again where we put our players in position where they can access the ball, and then they didn't really press. And so it became rather easy, especially with Setien's style of play, to pass their way out of the back and access our final third. But I don't know if that was the biggest issue. It was definitely an issue, but for me, what was much more worrying was the fact that we decided to set up in a 4-4-2 against a team that loves to use positional play, because positional play was essentially invented to defeat teams that played in the 4-4-2. And because of that, we saw for a period in like the early 2010s that the 4-4-2 became sort of obsolete because of that. And then we've kind of seen a resurgence with managers kind of adapting it to the modern game. But it didn't really work today. And the reason is because when you play in a 4-4-2, you are at a disadvantage in midfield numerically if you're playing a team that has three in midfield. So that doesn't seem to make sense on the face of it, because Betis played with the back five. So they had Marc Bartra in central defense. They had Mandi and they had Amat in central defense. So there were those three guys, and Bartra was in between both of the center backs flanking him. And so what Setien did was, when Betis were in possession, Bartra would step up into midfield and kind of act as a defensive midfielder. So there's two ways you can approach positional play. You can play with the back five, or you can go with the more classic traditional 4-3-3. And so the whole point of positional play is to have numerical superiority in all parts of the pitch when you're in possession. So when playing with the back five, you have three at the back, the fullbacks push up. So you have three center backs versus the two strikers. So if we're attempting to press the center backs, they can play their way around the strikers. And then when you move into midfield, Bartra will step up and he'll create an overload against Casemiro and Kovacic, and that's what they were doing. So to compensate for that, we started to move extremely narrow, because Setien would attempt to, for example, penetrate through the right wing through passing triangles. So it would be Ruiz, whichever player was the winger and the fullback, and then the striker. They'd all try to combine on the right flank, for example, and try to bypass us there. And so that gives them an overload on that side, and so we'd over adjust. So we bring our far side winger too narrow to try to make that area vertically compact, and that ruined our horizontal compactness, because then Betis would play their way out of that congested area and simply switch the ball to the onrushing fullback on the other side, and then they would access our final third. And for the first 11 minutes or so, we got away with it. And then we scored, and Betis decided to basically shape up and get into the game, and they stopped playing askew passes. And once they started completing their passes in the final third, it was pretty much over for us. And they destroyed us for large portions of the game, and it took a Sergio Ramos set piece to get us back in it, which knocked Betis off balance. And within a 9-minute period, Betis completely lost their composure. They were giving the ball away stupidly. Then we scored another goal, and then that was pretty much it. And then Casemiro chipped it to Ronaldo, and it was 4-2. And it was just too much for Betis to overcome. But from a tactical perspective, I do not think we approached this game properly. And it was concerning to me to see us approach a coach who is well known for his positional play. He almost always does it with the 4-4-2, with the formation that is generally weak to the type of play that is preferred by Setien. And I think it showed today, and I think we got away with it a little bit.
Everything you just said encapsulates perfectly why the 4-4-2 just didn't work. And there's only so much I can add to everything you just said, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But you look at all four of the midfielders, and neither of them are in a position to hold the line. Like, it's it's just they got sliced because they were outnumbered. And I think you look at the build up to the Nacho goal, it was basically the perfect example of how it went wrong, right? And then you look at Joaquin, who gets through. And by the way, Joaquin is just had an amazing career, and I love him. And as a player, he's just fun. He also gives us a lot of post-game goals generally throughout his career. He's just a really likable person. And God love him, and he's still playing at this level this late. But there's no way we should have made him look the way we did at certain times in this game. And in the build-up to the Nacho goal, he has so much space to run into that he actually takes a really heavy touch. And he just has so much time to make up for that heavy touch because no one is in sight to close him down. And then he passes it to the left, and then you have the Nacho on goal disaster. And I think even like offensively, like where was Gareth Bale in this game? And I think there's a question about this, but I think he was just isolated, and I don't like him in the 4-4-2. And he was quiet, and then when he got the ball, he didn't look that sharp. And a lot has been said about like this halftime team talk and like everything that changed in the second half. And Asensiooooo was candid about it after the game. He said that, we had an important halftime team talk, which is good. We want them to recognize the issues, obviously, and address them. Zidane said they pressed a bit better and all this, and actually talked about tactics in a rare moment after the game. I'm unsure if that is what really changed it. I think it was two things. So one is, first of all, Quique Setien team, it eventually collapses and it concedes. Like, they didn't play as well. It's true Real Madrid pressed them a bit, but they just opened up. And when the game opened up the way it did, it just allowed players like Lucas Vazquez. By the way, Lucas Vazquez was really good in this game. I think we should give him a special shout out.
Yep, that needs to be said.
Yeah, 6 key passes. He was really good defensively, as an individual. I think obviously there were like cohesive team problems defensively, but I thought he did well. But when that happened, it benefited Asensiooooo. It benefited Vazquez. It benefited Carvajal, who won an amazing tear to Asensio's second goal. And also Bale got a bit more involved at that point if he had been quiet all game. And the other thing you mentioned off air, which was really interesting, was what you pointed out was more than anything, more than the halftime team talk, I think it was the Ramos goal that changed it, right?
Yeah, the Ramos goal essentially changed everything because I think it's fair to say with Setien teams that they really react to events in the game, because a lot of the way that Setien wants his team to play, especially because his individuals aren't necessarily as talented as teams that usually play positional play, which are your Barcelonas, basically any team that plays under Pep Guardiola, and you have Sarri as well, so at Napoli. And so it requires the team to have a lot of confidence, because while there are a lot of talented players on Betis, they're not as good as, for example, Busquets or Piqué when playing out from the back. So they need a lot of confidence when they're playing out from the back, when they're trying to have these little 1-2 passes, when they're trying to do all these flicks. And I think the Ramos goal just deflated them because they felt like they were on top, and that goal just came out of nowhere. Because before that goal, it looked like Betis was going to thrash us again. They were not making our players to start the second half once again, which was kind of a running theme throughout the match. And then the Ramos goal just kind of came out of nowhere and deflated them. And right after that, you can immediately tell that Betis lost a bit of their composure, because they immediately started to give the ball away at the back, combined with the bit more consistent pressing, like Zidane mentioned after the match, definitely worked in our favor. And so in that 9-minute period I mentioned, our expected goals just shot up like crazy. If you go to understat.com and you look at the timing chart for expected goals, in between the Ramos goal and the Asensiooooo goal, our expected goals they went nuts. It just exploded, and Betis has just stayed the same. And then after that, the normal pattern of play resumed. And that essentially changed it. That tiny period where Ramos came in, scoring, I think, his second set piece goal in like a week or so, and Betis lost their composure, and that just shows how quickly a football game can change. And while I think it's sort of, you can take that as a negative, right? You can look at that and say, well, we didn't play good for most of the game, and we got kind of lucky that in this portion of the game we capitalized on it. But I think there's also a positive, right? Because so much of this season we haven't been capitalizing on chances. We haven't been taking chances in games where the momentum shifts in our favor, and we haven't managed to convert chances. And this game we did. And that's a positive thing, because when you're being outplayed, there are always going to be moments in a game where you can snatch the match back from the opponent, and we had that in this match, and we definitely snatched the chances, and that is something we're going to need going forward in the Champions League. So that was a positive thing to see.
Do you have the overall XG for this game?
Yes, I do. So it was, according to Understat, it was 2.47 expected goals for Real Betis and 1.84 for Real Madrid. So
unbelievable.
We definitely got a bit lucky. Whichever way you put it, we got lucky to come away with a 5-3 victory. But it's damn good to see that we have our shooting boots on finally.
This is crazy. So in the past few weeks, this is... You may or may not agree, but this is the reality, I think. We've seen the Real Madrid of last season.
Yeah, I agree.
So 5 against Sociedad, 5 against Betis, 3 against PSG, 7 against Depor, 4 against Valencia. And our XG has been low relative to what it was earlier this season, and we're just scoring now. It's actually amazing how much just putting the ball in the back of the net, how many problems it masks, isn't it? Like our tone completely changes, the way we talk, the way we are post game, the comments on Managing Madrid, how happy they are. Like it's literally, that's the margin of error. We put our chances away or we don't. Like it, we kind of brush aside the problems a bit. We know they're problems, but I mean, Zidane said, because someone asked him after the game about conceding and the way Betis played, and he was like, "Yeah, it doesn't bother me that we conceded 3 goals because we scored 5," and that's the reality. Like these are the articles we wrote in the preseason, and after the Super Cup, we were like, "Yeah, Real Madrid has." I wrote about it, how well Real Madrid started reading the passing lanes at that point. It was peaking, but anytime they did get beat, and they didn't have like a last-ditch tackle to save them, they would just overrun the opponent anyway. So it doesn't really matter so much that they leak goals here and there, because they just go on a tear on the other side. And the past 5-6 games, this is essentially it. Like we grind out results. We don't play particularly well. We finish our chances and we close the game out. And that's what we've been waiting for.
Yeah, and that's why I generally try to emphasize focusing on the process over the results. So I was arguing with one dude on Twitter who was...
You were arguing with a dude on Twitter? When does that happen?
So just par for the course for me, right? And he was trying to tell me that, in his opinion, the 4-4-2 wasn't necessarily an issue, seeing as we won the game, essentially. And it's just... Like, logically, that doesn't make sense, right? Because there are so many other factors that come into what defines a result. There's luck. There's individual performances, such as the Dani Carvajal run, where he beat 4 players and scored the goal, which had nothing to do with formation. And you have to consider all those factors when it's coming together. It's always about trying to isolate each factor in your mind and trying to analyze how that would affect the result. It's not simply a case of just looking at what correlates and saying there's causation, because there are so many factors. And for example, every time Lucas Vazquez has started for Real Madrid, we've won. And so you can say we should play Lucas Vazquez all the time, therefore we'll always win. And that's illogical, because that's obviously not going to happen, right? It's just a case of correlation, not equaling causation, which is not to say that Lucas Vazquez can't help us. He was brilliant this match. I love the guy. And I think he deserves a lot of the minutes he gets. But that's just an example of how you have to look deeper than that, and which is why it's more important to look at the process over results. And oddly enough, it's just not a thing that exists in the popular discourse of soccer. Whereas if you look at a sport like basketball, the whole idea of focusing on process over results is just a thing really present in the minds of fans. And it's something that the players are really open about. It's like Joel Embiid, who needs to come on the Managing Madrid podcast, by the way.
Yes.
his tagline is trust the process, and that's something that needs to transfer to football. Fans need to trust the process, or if the process isn't good enough, you need to amend it. Just looking at results isn't good enough because there's so much noise, especially in a sport like football, and especially when we don't necessarily have all the stats available to us to be able to analyze all that noise, to be very careful about how you look at results, because sometimes it just doesn't tell you the truth. It just doesn't tell you how good we're playing or how badly we're playing.
Yeah. So the Ramos, he's I think it's a second in within 2 weeks for sure. He scored off a set piece header. So your curse is completely broken.
Yeah, it's broken.
Just please don't write an article again about this subject. Just leave it. Here's some stats for you. And this is posted by Sergio Ramos, a Managing Madrid commenter. I told him I'd give him a shout out on the podcast. Real Madrid has now scored 6,000 goals.
In the league, right?
Is it the league? Yeah, in the league. Yeah, in La Liga. 1,000 of them in the past 10 years.
Jesus Christ.
So just to pay our respects, here are each player that scored the milestones. The first goal in La Liga history, Lazcano. I don't know who this person is. I would love to do some research on him. Sounds like an interesting article in the summertime when we don't have much to talk about. His name is Lazcano, 1929. Number 1,000, Paino, 1950. Number 2,000, Paco Gento, 1963. Number 3,000, Juanito, 1981. 4,000, Bam Bam Zamorano, 1994. 5,000, Guti, 2008. And 6,000 today, Marco Asensio, 2018. Just to pay our respects, Two elephants in the room. To me, Sergio Ramos and Casemiro's passing.
Yeah, I mean, especially Casemiro, right? Who, I mean, obviously there's Ramos as well, but Casemiro has looked this way for a good portion of the season now, and it's worrying because I didn't think he'd become suddenly like a Luka Modric or Toni Kroos when playing out from the back, but it looked like, especially from the Super Cup games and the way he performed to the latter part of the 2016-17 season, that he had improved significantly in his on-the-ball ability, his ability to deal with pressure, to the point where he wasn't a consistent liability anymore. And it looks like he's gone back to that. And it was really, really clear that Setien was targeting Casemiro with his press because he knew he was the most vulnerable link in the side, and he was vulnerable. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's not just the fact that Casemiro gives the ball away, it's the fact that he will complete his passes to his teammate, but the passes will be badly weighted, they'll be in the air. It's just the flight of the ball will be wrong, so it makes it difficult for his teammates to control the pass, and they'll end up losing the ball. And then you can see, right, like the whole team will start avoiding passing the ball to Casemiro in build up. If you look at the heat maps, Mateo Kovacic is deeper than Casemiro is. And heat maps represent all the touches a player has when he's on the ball. And so that is not something you want, right? Casemiro is the defensive midfielder. Kovacic is the offensively talented player. You want it to be the reverse. You want Kovacic higher up the pitch. And continually we see that Casemiro is always the one higher up the pitch because we need to dodge him in build up. And it's a problem, especially when we play teams who want to press like this. I mean, we're a bit lucky that Setien's teams aren't great defensively and that their back line isn't the most disciplined, as we saw in a lot of the goals they concede, in that when they press, the wingers don't track back. So even if they win the ball a lot, we'll still get a lot of chances to hit them on the counter. And it doesn't help, right, when you have a player like Casemiro who this is his weakness, when you have a player like Ramos who's usually reliable on the ball, giving it away all the time. And it wasn't just Ramos, to be honest. Kovacic looked pretty uncomfortable, which I think had something to do with him being partnered with Casemiro. And yeah, it was something that could have lost us the game, because especially in the first 11 minutes where the game was really back and forth, Betis were not completing their passes in the final third. They were looking to find the rhythm, and if they had in that section of the game, they could have ended the whole thing before halftime. Essentially, when they found their rhythm, they just didn't have enough time to put away 3 goals.
Yeah, I mean, if we're being completely fair, Kovacic just wasn't good either.
Mm-hmm.
Kovacic lost possession 5 times.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the reality is I'm not sure how much this scheme benefited him. But also, I'm not sure if we've seen the Kovacic that we know this season yet. I'm trying to think back to standout performances. I can't think of any, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm sure there are a couple, but they're just not coming. I'm just not able to remember. And I think a lot of it has to do with, is he's played, when he played, especially in the Copa del Rey matches, he's played with an entirely new team, right? He's played with Llorente and Ceballos in midfield, and he hasn't had any sort of stability in his midfield partnerships, and he hasn't been able to thrive. And this game it would have sucked to play as a Real Madrid central midfielder in this game, because on defense you were getting overloaded constantly. If you were trying to tackle one man, there was always a free man for the other team to pass to. And then on offense, you were getting pressed all over the place. And if you were Kovacic, as the game passed on, you were the only outlet that Real Madrid were looking for if they were looking to play out the back. And Casemiro, I mean, to be fair, Betis did press really well at times. So even if Casemiro and Kovacic had been damn near perfect in possession, they would have lost it a lot. But yeah, it wasn't a good day for our central midfielders.
Let's take some questions. So we have Patreon questions that we want to address. So patreon.com/Managing Madrid is where you can go to join our ever-growing Patreon family. You can support the show. You can pledge as little as $1. You get bonus patron shows, midweek shows, and all the Champions League ones fall under there. So the PSG game last week was one of our most listened to podcasts, and that was for our patrons. And the second leg, also patron podcast. If you want access to those plus other rewards, check us out, patreon.com/Managing Madrid. First patron question from Sayantan Nandi. Is Bale trying too hard or lacking in confidence, or is the 4-4-2 not suiting him?
So, yeah, this was something you addressed earlier, and I think it's the latter.
Yeah.
Bale is definitely not lacking in confidence since coming back. I don't know what benching him versus PSG might have done to his mentality, but since coming back from injury, he's been one of our best players, and I think Bale's a professional. I don't think he would have let that affect him too much, and it's just he's not a striker. I don't know what else to say. You can't put players in positions that they're not suited to, and I think because the 4-4-2 with Ronaldo and Bale up top worked so well versus Dortmund and the group stage match in the Champions League this season, people got kind of excited for it, because a lot of people were and still are tired of having Benzema on the side playing up top with Ronaldo. Mm-hmm. And what they want to see is a Bale-Ronaldo pairing, so Benzema is out of the side. And I mean, I get it if you think Benzema's past it, you don't want him on the side as much, but replacing him with Bale in a 4-4-2 is not the solution, because the thing with the Dortmund match was Dortmund was just horrible defensively. They had such a high line, and they weren't pressing effectively within it. All we had to do was just play the ball over the top and have Bale and Ronaldo run in behind, and so obviously they were effective there.
Right.
But against any other team that's even remotely competent, it's just uncomfortable for Bale. If you look at his heat map, he hardly touched the ball in central areas at all. Yeah. He barely touched the ball. He had 25 touches. Yeah. And when he did, it was all out wide, because that's where he's comfortable. He's not a player that will lead the line for you. I mean, he can drift centrally all over the place, but he should definitely not be restricted there. In a 4-4-2, you need two classic center forwards working in tandem, and one of those players has to be the player that moves into midfield to link, while the other one runs in behind, and they can alternate doing that, but one player always has to be doing that. And Bale and Ronaldo are just too similar in the way they approach the game, because they're both wingers who are placed as center forwards, that it's just never gonna work the best. And Ronaldo, who's become accustomed to playing as a striker, played very well. But Bale, who's not, and who I don't think ever will be, just obviously was not a big part of that game for large periods until Betis started giving the ball away, and we were able to transition high up the pitch, and then we created a couple of chances for Bale, but that was about it.
So the only starter on the field who had less touches and made less passes than him was Cristiano Ronaldo.
Yeah.
And I guess Ronaldo just got the ball in better positions. Like, to me, the 4-4-2 just isolates him. If you want to bench Benzema, the solution for me is always to put Bale in a deeper role, because he wasn't really pressing in this game. He wasn't helping the midfield during that barrage, and the team was still outnumbered there. Just put him a bit deeper. It shouldn't have to be a 4-4-2 for him to thrive. He looked lost. I don't think it's a confidence issue, or it had to do with not starting against PSG, because he came on against PSG and looked really good in that game, the same game. So I don't think his confidence all of a sudden vanished, but I think he just needs to be a bit more involved. He needs to be the alpha male in order to thrive. And when he's barely touching the ball all game, and then when he does get it, he doesn't look sharp. He looks a bit cold. He had that missed chance. He had a couple moments where he just couldn't get past his man. It wasn't him tonight.
And
yeah.
And the point about Ronaldo having less touches but performing better is a good one, because that shows that Ronaldo has accustomed himself to playing this role. Because whenever Ronaldo plays in this kind of system, he doesn't get nearly as many touches as he does when he's out wide. So he knows how to be efficient with his movements, where he needs to be to be able to make an impact with the minimal amount of touches he's going to get. Because despite the small amount of touches he got, no one who saw that game is going to come away thinking Ronaldo played a bad game or that he wasn't effective.
Yeah.
Because he had the most shots on the team. He had 5 shots. He created 2 chances. He had 2 dribbles. And like you said, he was receiving the ball in better positions. And if you look at his heat map, he was also receiving the ball centrally as well. His touches were more distributed. So it's something he's accustomed to, and it's something Bale isn't. And while Bale is in his prime, I don't think we should be playing him in such limited roles. I think it makes sense with Ronaldo, right? Because he doesn't necessarily impact the overall game in the way that he used to. So it's okay to put him in an area where he's there to affect the final third and the final third only. But for Bale, while he's in his prime, we need to put him in situations where he can influence the whole game, because that's where he's still the most effective, and that's what he's most comfortable doing at the moment.
Right. And also Ronaldo is maybe the most underrated just off-ball mover in history.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we spend, not we, but the general public, so much of it, they spend so much time talking about this tap-ins. If tapping the ball was that easy, everyone would have as many goals as Ronaldo. He's a genius off the ball. He knows, he has instinct that you just can't teach. And so he doesn't need many touches. But I think someone like Bale, he needs to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
Josie Dos Santos, another patron, says, after the PSG game, I said I thought Asensiooooo should start the second leg. After an amazing performance in this game, is it any more likely? Yeah, I feel like maybe we didn't talk about Asensiooooo enough, but he was...
Asensiooooo is fabulous. Yeah. Is it more likely? At this point, I don't know if I can really predict what Zidane does anymore. I don't know if I ever could. I think him benching Bale versus the PSG game, which is a big shock, because Bale always starts when fit, and if there was, because there were a lot of people convinced that even after Bale came back from injury, Isco was going to stay on the lineup, but that didn't happen. Bale came back in; he was immediately the number one guy, and that's why it was so surprising to see Isco play versus PSG. So I think because of the desperate position we were in at the time, entering the PSG game, 4th in the league, and now we have a 3-1 advantage, and I think Zidane might just say, what the hell, let me just try things, which has generally been his philosophy, especially when he feels like everything is against him. So I don't know. I wouldn't put it past him to see Asensio start, but I just hope it's not in some kind of like diamond thing. Usually if Asensio starts, it's like a 4-4-2 or 4-3-3, and I hope we don't see the 4-4-2 with Bale and Ronaldo again. If he starts, I would like to see Benzema and Ronaldo up top if it's a 4-4-2, but I don't know what that does to Bale, and I would really like Bale to play versus PSG. So I guess a 4-3-3 with maybe Ronaldo up top as a lone forward might be all right. There's a lot of possibilities, but I just hope that he doesn't, if he's going to start Asensio, he doesn't squeeze him in a way that compromises the balance of the rest of the team, which is kind of what we saw with Isco and the diamond for this season.
I'm sure Asensio plays one way or the other, whether it's off the bench. I have my doubts that he'd start, but you know, who knows? Like you said, it's unpredictable in many ways what Zidane's going to do. I imagine there's going to be a plethora of counter-attacking opportunities against PSG in the second leg. So I think it's crazy if Bale doesn't start that game. I mean,
I agree. They're going to have to go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I made the point to Gabe because I said the same thing to Gabe, but then I was trying to play the devil's advocate to that on the Patreon pod after the game last week, and I said, well, maybe Zidane sees just wants to control the game again if PS and just hold the ball and see the game out and then bring Bale in the second half again. But either way, I think Bale starts. Like he's part of our best 11. I think he should start. By the way, someone asked on Twitter, quick deviation from Patreon questions, a non-Patreon question on Twitter on the Managing Madrid account. It's from @Bale_RM_. He says, if Marcelo doesn't make it for the PSG game, who would you rather have as a left back, Nacho or Theo? So I don't think there's any updates, but apparently it's a right hamstring thing, and hopefully it's just a precaution. But in a theoretical situation where I don't think it will get to that, it's always Nacho in that situation, right?
Yeah.
Because this
100%.
basically, the only reason I'm taking this question even is because it leads us into a Theo discussion. And one of the things we forgot to talk about was the fact that Real Betis are notorious for making late game comebacks. They've come back in crazy fashion, like with 10 minutes to go a lot of times this season. And if they don't make the full remontada, they score, they get consolation goals, and they make the opponent sweat. And we were up 2 goals, and Sergio Leon scored. And then you zoom out, and you realize Theo's just jogging back. And he could have prevented that goal. He has the pace, he has the power, he had the fresh legs to do it, and he just didn't. And you just can't switch off. You can't switch off in any game. You can't switch off for sure with a 2-goal lead against Betis away from home.
Yeah. Just as a side note, that goal is another perfect example of how Setien manipulated the 4-4-2 with positional play, if you're interested in going back and seeing that. Because even though Isco came on, we still defended in a 4-4-2 with Asensio joining Ronaldo up top. But besides that, right, like you're completely correct. I thought up till that point Theo was actually okay. I mean, he had a really good run forward, I think, on one of them where he took out 2 guys and burst into the box. And offensively, he was showing a lot more than I'd seen from him in the past this season, and that was promising. But I mean, I guess that's just I don't know if it's so much about effort as much as just him switching off. I think that's at the 84th minute, I think, is when the goal happened. With us we're up 2 goals, it's 4-2. I think he's just not necessarily paying attention to his surroundings. He's caught ball watching. He doesn't see the player sneaking at the back post. Obviously, I'm not excusing that. I'm not saying that that's acceptable. It's obviously a terrible mistake, but I think that's just part of the learning process with the young fullback like Theo. And it was disappointing because I think it's going to overshadow what I think was one of his better games to the offensive side, because I think there were positives to take there. But yeah, that was definitely not a great moment for him.
Mark Rady says, holy crap, that game almost blew out my heart. I love watching this season's Betis as it's always a goal fest. How will Madrid do without Kroos for the next few weeks? Thanks again. So, 2 weeks. I think it won't be as bad if Modric is there. Modric just has this trait about him where he just organizes everybody. He's composed. He controls the tempo. He's insanely smart defensively. Always covering, always helping, always showing as an outlet. And obviously the game looks completely different with Modric there. I don't know. Do you see much changing? Like last year we saw Kroos go out for an extended period of time and Kovacic slid in and he was really good. We even lost Kroos and Casemiro at the same time, and Kovacic really stepped up. So I think if you have Kovacic and Modric together, which I think this should be an opportunity for Kovacic, in my opinion, he should be the one to get a lot of playing time here. I think the team will be fine.
I think for 2 weeks we can be all right, but if in answering specifically when he says, well, how will he do? I think we'll do fine, but if you're looking at things that we lose without Kroos there, because there's always some of those people that are like, what does Kroos give us?
Yeah.
If you look at a game like today where we're being pressed and the opposition is relentless and the midfield is getting overloaded, you look at a player like Kroos, who is a press-resistant genius. I mean, we would have looked a lot calmer under that Betis press with Kroos in the side. Not just because he can pass his way out of it perfectly, but because of the way he intelligently positions himself to overload opposition presses, how he has this clever little first touch that takes the ball away from the defender and gives him space and time to play his next pass. Obviously, Modric is also a press resistance genius, but I think Kroos is really the best in the world at that. And when it comes to needing some player to slow down the tempo and regain control of the game, it's Kroos, because so much of the game against Betis was defined by back and forth play. And I always get nervous when that happens, because that kind of blows the game wide open and it can go either way. And especially when you're in the lead, you want a player who can just slow things down and control things. And as good as Kovacic is as a player, I don't think that's really a trait he has. I think he sometimes thrives on the chaos because of how good he is with the ball, but that can also lead to the game getting away from a team. And I think a player like Kroos would just slow things down and just assert his influence over the game. And so it shouldn't be the biggest deal to not have him for the next 2 weeks, given the depth in midfield we have. But if we're going to play like this, then yes, I think he will be a big miss.
Being press resistant and being press resistant the way Kroos is one of the most underrated things and unnoticed things, I think, in football. And I think it's one of those things that it's not as easily visible on the pitch, but if you just watch Kroos without the ball the entire game, you'll truly appreciate what he brings to the table. You said press resistant genius. I think I 100% agree with that wording. Last patron question. I don't know if it's a question, if it's a comment. It's just a cool thing. So one of our patrons, Sheikh Atiri, went in and did a deep dive on some stats. And it's an observation that we can kind of just talk about, and it will take us away from this Betis game. Shay says, I couldn't fall asleep, so I did a little statistic digging. The last time we topped the table and least goals conceded was 2007-2008. During this time, Barcelona has topped 5 times and Atletico 4 times. Since Simeone, we haven't even finished second, often third and occasionally fourth. Things get better. The second last time we topped the table was 1992-1993 season. In fact, since 1968/69, we have topped the table of the goals conceded only 6 times. Last year, we had 10 clean sheets. Barcelona had 13, Atletico 19. We couldn't even keep our goals shut against Real Sociedad. What the F is wrong with us? This is the greatest club on earth. How can we not figure out our defensive system? We have had 8th and 10th place finishes in the 2000s. Can you make sense out of this? And how did Victor Valdez, who at his prime couldn't save a ball for his life, win 5 Zamora trophies? I think peak Valdez was okay.
He's not as bad as people like to pretend he was, but his shot stopping abilities weren't on the level of, say, an Iker Casillas. I think honestly that's a good way to start answering that question, right? Because the reason Valdez was such a valued goalkeeper in Barcelona, and especially under Pep, was because he was so good for Barcelona's system. Because he was one of the first goalkeepers of this newer generation of goalkeepers that played the ball out of the back fairly well, which is what you need in a positional play system under Pep Guardiola. You need your goalkeeper to be able to pass his way out of the back, because Pep doesn't just want to bomb the ball up the field. And so that idea of having players that fit a system and having systems, concrete philosophies like that is going to influence your defensive system. So if you want to wonder why Barcelona's defense has acquired more clean sheets than us over this period that has been named, it is because their system has generally been, especially in the past decade or so, has been more cohesive. It's been more competent. So, because when you look at our defenders individually with Barcelona's, we always say ours are better, but as a system, Barcelona's defensive system is better because they press really well, they press cohesively, everyone does their part in the side, and there's always a consistent tactical plan that's applied every time. And this is especially true under Valverde, who's one of the best pressing coaches in the entire world. And Real Madrid has never pressed consistently as far back as you can go, and a lot of the players that we've bought, especially in the early 2000s, made it very, very difficult to defend as a team, and it put a lot of pressure on our talented defensive players. I mean, we had Fabio Cannavaro at one point. He was who was named the best player in the world, and he looked terrible at times in our system. And it's simply because the systems we have constructed and this lack of a philosophy in that sense, right, that managers don't have to adhere to. And some of the transfer policy that we've had over time has made it very, very difficult to be a consistent defensive team. And it's as simple as that. I mean, it's no surprise to see that Simeone comes to Atletico Madrid, institutes a very specific, cohesive defensive system, and then acquires talent that helps solidify that defensive system, and then they have 4 clean sheets in how many every years that was named. I mean, it's as simple as that. It has to do with system, it has to do with personnel, and the fact that Real Madrid is inconsistent in both.
I have this theory that Real Madrid will never be a great defensive team ever. And it just wasn't meant to be for us. And I came to this conclusion in 2006, 2007, when you brought this up, kind of. But we signed Fabio Cannavaro, who had one of the greatest seasons a defender has ever had in the history of the game. And he dominated a World Cup like I never knew a defender could dominate it. Like I've never seen a defender dominate a tournament, and he did it. And we brought him in, and it was like we were like all little kids in a candy store because we didn't know what to do. We've never actually signed a defender like that. Like our signings have never been so focused on getting the best defender in the world. It was always about like who was the biggest offensive unicorn and how do we fill the team with stars. We brought in Cannavaro, and it was crazy exciting, and he just looked, he was a black hole. He was suffering, he was treading water, he was a disaster. And at that point I made up my mind that if we had brought in Prime Beckenbauer and Prime Baresi as a partnership, they would still be bad. And it's a systematic, schematic issue. Now, having said that, we will have exceptions to this rule. So the following year, 2007, 2008, was when we had a really solid defensive line where Cannavaro played a little bit better because it was Cannavaro, it was Ramos, it was Gabriel Heinze, and Pepe. Pepe was the big one. Pepe, Ramos, Cannavaro, Heinze. And those 4 worked well together. And one of the greatest performances by a defender I've ever seen in Real Madrid shirt was Pepe that year in a Clásico where he put Samuel Eto'o in his pocket. So there's exceptions to this rule, but I think generally, like, you know, unless like Mourinho comes every now and then, we play really defensive. Like, it's hard to compete. Barcelona aren't a good defensive team theoretically, but the reason they don't concede goals is because of the reasons you mentioned. They're tremendous at counter-pressing and holding the ball, and they defend by holding the ball. And they play a high line and they try to snuff out every counter-attack. And Athletic are great because their whole identity is built around being defensive. And Real Madrid has just never been that historically. Like, even before this kind of surge of good defenders we got now, like, and this era with Pepe and Ramos, before that, you know, we had Hierro and Santa Maria and Sanchez, and we didn't really have like a long list of great central defenders. It was never really in our DNA. So,
I mean, I think what people need to understand when it comes to defensive solidity is that system matters more than personnel, and I think this is why attackers cost more than defenders do, because it is much harder for an individual defender to make an impact the same way an individual attacker can. So, I mean, we've seen countless amounts of sides where an individual attacker can just carry his team's entire offense and make things happen and push them up the table. But it's very, very difficult for an individual defender to do it because it relies so much more on a system, right? Because if you're a great individual attacker, you can just take the ball and you can dribble past a bunch of players. But when you're a defender, you're working without the ball. And when you're working without the ball, you have to work in tandem with the people next to you. So if you take Leonardo Bonucci, who in my opinion was the best defender in the world last season, and he was put in AC Milan, a team that, especially at the beginning of the season, did not have a great defensive system, and he looked disastrous. I mean, people were wondering, how did I ever think he was the best defender in the world? And it's because, while he definitely was, it just matters so much less to have quality individual defenders than it does to have a quality individual system. It doesn't matter how great you are. I mean, Sergio Ramos, for all the stick he gets, and I've criticized him a ton of times for not being consistent enough. Some of that is simply down to the fact that Real Madrid aren't a consistent defensive unit. I mean, sometimes he truly is spectacular and will still ship 3 goals because there's only so much one guy can do if the people around him aren't working in tandem. And I think that pretty much explains, along with the reasons we mentioned before, why Real Madrid have never consistently been a good defensive side.
I mean, look at the goals we've conceded this season. Like, of course we can blame individual players, but we just, like, look at the goal we conceded against Betis earlier this season, that loss. The goals we conceded against Tottenham, against Malaga, against, you know, just go down the list. A lot of these were just us being gung-ho and just not defending. And you can't blame individual players. I mean, you can to an extent, but again, like, these are just schematic issues. And this is why we concede. I mean, we went for years, like in the mid-2000s, where we just, you know, we had some bad years defensively there, especially. And we had, like, I remember a pairing of a really, really old Hierro and Helguera together. And Helguera was out of position and Hierro was a grandfather. And then we tried with Pavon, and then we had, like, all these little, like, we had, like, a lot of journeymen who came and went. And it was just, and for years, the only reason, by some miracle, we didn't concede 3 million goals per game was because Iker Casillas was on a completely different level. Like, he was a complete alien, and he was a one-man defensive line just stopping everything. Like, for years, literally, we had, the only reason we were winning games was because Casillas was saving everything. And then we had no defense, no midfield, and then OG Ronaldo was scoring. It was like a two-man team. Casillas saving and OG Ronaldo was scoring goals. And that's what it was for like a year or two. And, you know, so I think it's just not in our DNA. And why it's not in our DNA is because of the reasons we mentioned and you mentioned, is because we have a lot of schematic issues that just kind of disregard a lot of defensive principles.
And it wasn't, speaking of like how I was talking about how individuals can't make that much of a difference, it speaks to, I think, the fact that Varane has actually had a fantastic individual season and not enough people are talking about it. And I've heard commentators, I've seen people on Twitter saying Varane's having a bad season because of how much we conceded.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for Varane, if you thought it was bad now, it would be if this isn't a disaster, it would be a disaster. It would be unholy on a different level if Varane wasn't playing. And this is one of the greatest individual defensive seasons I've ever seen. I mean, it's on par with Pepe in 13-14 and 14-15, and Ramos in 13-14, which I think was his best defensive season. It's on par with Bonucci 16-17. I mean, it's spectacular, and it's completely being overshadowed because system is always more important than individual quality, especially when it comes to defense. And I think it also speaks to the fact that Varane's been that good that despite that, he's still been able to have a huge impact. And I think he deserves a ton of credit for that, even though it doesn't really have much to do with that game. I think every podcast I'm going to talk about this because he doesn't get enough credit for it.
I've seen this narrative floating around that Varane's had a bad season, and anyone who doesn't realize how great Varane has been this season, I just don't trust them. Like at any level, on any opinion, like at all. When you really just are that naive to not understand what Varane has done this season in a season of defensive chaos, then I'm sorry, you just way off the mark. He's been amazing. Arvind, any concluding thoughts? Anything to plug before we wrap it up?
No, I'm just really, really, really happy that we're winning again. It's ugly at times, but that was how we won last season. We won 2 trophies. I'm just happy we're winning and scoring goals again.
I'm with you. Best part of the podcast now was patron shoutouts. So shout out to all you amazing patrons. The list just grows and grows every day. After the PSG game, by the way, it was the patron-only podcast, and I woke up the next day and I checked my email, and my email was just flooded with new pledges. So thank you to everyone. I'm glad you're on board. Hope you stick with us. Shout out to all of our patrons. Shout out to these patrons specifically who pledged $10 or more, because that's one of the rewards if you pledge $10 or more. So shout out to Frederick Sundros, Leon Stavronakis, Bjorn Salvador, Nick DeStefane, John Fernandez, Said Mahad, Sergio Monleon, Red Bat, Anthony Vazquez, Yahya Ibrahim, Nick Ribeiro, Eric Rogers, Sheikh Atiri, Ian Marley, Dan Bertha, new patron, welcome Dan, Andrew Gomez, Anton Hackberg, Jimmy Obeid, Daniel Smith, Solomon Ortiz, and Jeanette. You guys are unbelievable. Thank you so much for all your support. And Om sounds great with his new mic. Thanks to you guys.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys.
Yeah. And big shout out to Andrew Caleb Gomez. He is the creator of the sound, the music you hear in the intro and the outro. If you need music, he's your go-to. Message him on Patreon or Twitter. And as always, thanks for listening, and Hala Madrid.
Hala Madrid.